is going to be talking about bed fumigation and other ways to live with the new EPA rules on soil fumigation. So with that, you want to come up, Tom?
Do you want to give me a heads up when I have 5 minutes to go?
Sure. Yeah.
That'd be great.
Yeah, laser on top and...
Got it. Well, I think I could summarize my talk by saying I agree with everything that Inga Zasada just said in her second talk, and we could call it good. So then really the only question remaining is, what kind of value can I give you above and beyond Inga's talk for the next 20 minutes or so? And I guess I can give you a little bit more detail on why we got into the bed fumigation, and also a couple of ideas on what are the limitations and what are some of your other options to consider. This is a project that Inga and I were involved with support from the USDA RAMP grant. Also, we had a Washington State block grant for this work. Let's see if I can figure out the computer. So this all goes back to EPA's changes in soil fumigant regulations, which, raise your hand if you haven't heard about the new EPA soil fumigant regulations. Is there anybody that's managed to escape these that is not just making fun of me like Tom in the back? No, you've all heard about this, right? It's brought big changes to us in the States for how we can manage fumigations. Now you have to have, if I can get my laser pointer working here. There it is. Now you have to have a fumigant management plan every time you fumigate. There is a lot of outreach and applicator training that has to be done by the registrants and by the custom applicators. There's this new concept of things called sensitive areas, daycare centers, hospitals, jails, schools, any place that the EPA considers to be a hard to evacuate area. You have to know where those are. You have to work that into your fumigant management plan and show how you've demonstrated that there aren't any sensitive areas within a quarter or half mile of your fumigated area. There's new posting and emergency preparedness requirement, and then in red here is also the concept of buffers and buffer credits. So, you've probably heard me say dozens, maybe hundreds of times about how if you're going to fumigate the way you always have, is if you fumigate a 20-acre field with Telone C35, your buffer could be as high as 600 feet if you don't qualify for any of the credits. And that's huge. Very few of us have fields that don't have a house or other habitated structure within 600 feet of the field. So this is, you've seen this before. This is just a field, 20-acre field to be fumigated. This is the 600-foot buffer, half a dozen houses within that. And then if you, instead of fumigating the whole field, you only fumigate the planting beds and you cover that with a tarp, you have a 25-foot buffer instead of a 600-foot buffer, which makes it obviously a lot more manageable. But it brings up a lot of questions in people's minds, and the chief among these is the question that Daryl Ellers asked Inga. What about the nematodes that are in the alleyways that don't get fumigated? What about the Phytophthora that's in the alleyways that doesn't get fumigated? Isn't that going to become a problem in these bed fumigated fields? Well, we didn't know the answer to that 4 years ago. So we set up 5 trials to evaluate that. 3 of them up here in the Linden area, and 2 down in Skagit County in Burlington and Mount Vernon. They all had different levels of P. penetrans and P. rubi pressure. They had different kinds of soils, and they were treated differently by the growers who were participating in these trials. And we've evaluated these over the last, well, it's been 3.5 years now. We've evaluated them. We've done yield evaluations. We've done growth measurements. We've done a soil bioassay for P. rubi. We didn't have the PCR assay to do it with. And we've done P. penetrans extraction. This is Inga's lab that's done all this, the P. penetrans evaluations. So we've followed these for, pretty much half of the lifetime of an average raspberry planting. Well, what have we found? The first year we looked at cane height. These are the different trials, Burlington, the Linden trials, the Mount Vernon trial, and these are the different treatments. In almost all cases, there was no difference between bed fumigated plots and broadcast fumigated plots. The only place that there was a difference was the first Burlington trial, and in this trial, actually the bed fumigated plots gave us plants that were bigger than the broadcast fumigated plots. We also looked at yield. Inga showed you this slide. And again, the bottom line here is that there is no difference except for that Burlington trial where we got actually better yields in the bed fumigated plots than in the broadcast fumigated plots. Looking at the bioassays early on, again, it's pretty much the same story. Here's 4 of the trials, Burlington, the 3 Linden trials. Here is root rot severity. A higher number means more root rot. And generally, there's no difference between the treatments in any of the trials except in this one, which this one turned out to be the one where we had the highest root rot pressure. And here, when we measured it in the beds, there was less root rot in the bed fumigated plots than there was in the broadcast fumigated ones. Kind of fast forward from 2011 up to this past year, 2013, here's another bioassay we did. Here we're comparing the average values from the alleyways and the beds. And then we're looking in the beds at the averages for the different treatments. And what you see here is, 3.5 years from fumigation, we don't have any significant differences between bed and broadcast fumigated treatments. But what we do have in 2 of these locations is the difference between the alleyways and the beds. And you remember, Daryl, you remember your question, well, what about the alleyways? I think what this is showing is that the alleyways aren't really much of a problem. So look at, this is Linden 3. In this trial, this is the trial that had the most root rot. Here, we had pretty high root rot symptoms when we sampled from the beds, but we had hardly any root rot symptoms when we sampled from the alleyways. There's no host for root rot in the alleyways, so it just doesn't thrive there. And if you look at these other 2 Linden trials, there's really no difference here, but the pressure in the beds is lower than it is at Linden 3. At Burlington, where the pressure in the beds was higher, again, there's less pressure in the alleyways. So from the standpoint of root rot, so far, we've got really no sign at all that we have root rot moving into the beds from the alleyways in these trials. In fact, if anything, early on, the bed fumigated treatments are sometimes a bit better. 3 years on, they're certainly no worse than the broadcast treated plots. And the amount of inoculum that we've got, potential root rot, is much worse in the beds than it is in the alleyways. So then looking at Inga's specialty, P. penetrans, here's 2 of the trials from Linden. This is the one that Inga had featured earlier. She's showing you that the tarped fumigation, worked better than the non-tarped and worked better than the broadcast. Here's another trial also at Linden. This one had pretty high background populations, and again, the bed fumigation treatment is working better, giving us longer control than the broadcast fumigation. So in these trials that we had, basically from the standpoint of efficacy, bed fumigation was at least as good as broadcast fumigation, sometimes better when we had more disease pressure or more Pradolenchus pressure. And that's probably not because bed fumigation with a tarp is great or is perfect, because it's not. That's probably because the way we fumigate now, broadcast fumigation with a packed surface, has its limitations. You know, we do a pretty good job down deep using that method, but we probably are a bit weak up near the surface. Daryl, in your very perceptive comment earlier, you mentioned how we've learned that you can plant the cover crop just before fumigating, and it'll survive just fine. If we have a good fumigation, it shouldn't work, but it does.
One observation is when we, like in our broadcast fumigation, they'll pack it, and we double or triple pack it with our stroke wood, and I'm not smelling any smell from that site. But then I go in the spring and February to plant, and when I go in with a field cultivator, I can start smelling. So I'm finding in our soil that either that surface packing, and don't never go back in, that surface packing, I find that I get the strong smell from it when I start moving around.
Yeah, later on, you notice it. Yep. But there are challenges with bed fumigation, and those are some of the things that growers had talked to us about. You know, our shaper only makes 8-inch high beds. A lot of growers want a higher bed than that, so they'd need a different shaper. You would definitely need some way to assure that the beds are put in the right place, because you only have one shot at making these beds and putting them in, because you're fumigating them at the same time and you can't move them. And it takes more time. You know, this shaper usually moves 3 miles an hour, and Trident's rig is moving at about twice that rate. So you have to plan, you need a longer window to make it work. But I want to talk a little bit about other options as well as bed fumigation. You know, that a lot of you know that our neighbors across the border do most of their fumigations with Vapam. And that is a possibility. There are some advantages of that. If you compare fumigating a 20-acre field with Telone C35 or with Vapam, and if you take the credits that you'd get typically for this level of organic material, with the C35 you wind up with a 460-foot buffer. That's still pretty long. That's a big buffer. But with Vapam, at the full rate of Vapam, 75 gallons per acre, you wind up with a 96-foot buffer. Oh, well, that might be a lot more workable. Vapam, though, sometimes gets a bad rap. Some people have had a lot of trouble with Vapam applications, and oftentimes their complaints go back to the fact that Vapam is generally less volatile than 1,3-D, certainly a lot less volatile than the chloropicrin in Telone C35. And so it doesn't move itself through the soil very effectively. As you know, it has to be moved through the soil. And last May, I was in Mexico looking at a strawberry nursery that was looking at fumigation alternatives. And they were trialing this thing. This is a rotary spader. And rotary spaders are commonly used to incorporate organic material. Organic growers use them very often. This particular rotary spader had some modifications to make it into a pretty darn good Vapam applicator. So you can see the big tanks for Vapam up ahead. It's a pretty hefty tractor, about 250 horse pulling this thing. The Vapam gets injected in these little sweeps that are about 12 inches under the soil surface, just in front of the shaper. Then there's the sweep. Just behind the sweep, and I'm sorry for the kind of dark color here, there's the rotary spader. These things are sort of like a rototiller tine, but they move more soil and they move a lot more slowly. They're not chopping up the soil, but they're mixing the soil. That's incorporating this Vapam very, very effectively. Behind these, there's another set of nozzles that puts the remaining 25% of the Vapam, and then there's a very shallow incorporator that incorporates it into the upper inch or two of surface for weed control. After that, there's a power roller that gives you a fairly slick surface. They were just demonstrating to us, so you can see the little holes and things, but by and large, they're getting a very slick surface on this. This is an interesting tool because it's really changed the way that Vapam has been used by strawberry nurseries in Europe. They used to regard Vapam as kind of a second-rate application, and now it is their main method of application. It's one of the best for them because it's incorporated very thoroughly. There are several of these rigs in eastern Washington now, and I understand there's actually a couple growers here in the Linden area that are looking at purchasing some of these. So I hope we'll be able to get some trials out with these this coming year. There are a lot of other options that we haven't talked about, that we haven't even looked at very carefully yet for our applications. There's another fumigant out there that we have just stayed away from. It's called Paladin. We've stayed away from it because it stinks. Literally, it stinks. It's a very, very strong smelling product. And current label says you can only apply it under a TIF or VIF tarp. These are specialized tarps that are very impermeable. They'll keep the stink in the ground. But the good thing about Paladin is that for most bed applications, it's got a very, very small buffer. For some fields that may not have much in the way of a Phytophthora problem or a nematode problem, it may be worth considering mustard meals. There's certainly a wide range of mustard meals that are available now. We've had good luck with mustard meals on Phytophthora in greenhouse tests, less encouraging results in the field. I'd certainly love to see some trials go out of these, but I certainly wouldn't bet the farm on them quite yet. The rotary spader may be a very good tool for incorporating these as well. That's about it. I must be running low on my time right now, other than to thank the folks that have been involved with this work and have been funding it. So, do I have time for questions, Chris?
One quick question.
One quick question.
We're joking. We're going to get Daryl's on mic.
On this rotary sprayer, and now you're talking about this mustard meal. Is this a dry product? And is that unit capable of incorporating then dry products along with either spray-on?
Yeah, mustard meals are sold usually as dry products. Sometimes people will sell them as pellets, but it's better to get them as pressed pellets. They look sort of like cornflakes, so they got more surface area. And you would have to scatter that across the field and then incorporate it.
Okay. So the timing of say if you went through and spread, oh, okay, he said I'm done.
Oh, he said one question. Okay.
If you're spreading it across the field, then you're not going to get the chemical or whatever to permeate, so you can be able to have time to incorporate it
For the meal?
rather than put it on it together.
Yeah, the meals don't